Hello, my name is Dr. Scott Young with Matt Moore, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about the Federal Reserve. So we need to know about the history of money coming right up. Okay, so let's go through the Federal Reserve, and I'm going to start us off with this a little bit, and we're going to do a whole bunch more when we do a little bit on our channel here with that. But let me give you a short background on this kind of thing. The ownership of the Federal Reserve, and he's going to speak this just as much as I could, but by the way, it's private bankers. They're large bankers, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, Chase, City, the Windsors, the Queen of England, and other central bankers. Now, one of the fascinating points that I like bringing up is I used to love stories about the Titanic.
Yeah.
And Titanic goes down in April of 1912. They're going across the Atlantic. And there was always an issue. There was the sister ship. What was that sister? Do you
I know what you're talking about.
There's a sister ship that was right around that same time frame that actually had some structural flaws that they didn't know about. And there's some possibility that they flipped the switch, the ships between it, and put the sister ship and put Titanic because there were some points that it was very possible that there was new painting upon the side of this. And they broke every single rule as they went across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And, going in still waters, at the middle of the night where you can't see anything without any radar. This is way before radar issues. And then you run into an iceberg.
Yep.
And one of the powerful things I always love thinking about is there were three major money dudes that were on that ship. And Jacob Astor's one of them. There are other ones. You can kind of look it up here with that. And by the way, those three guys were against the creation of the Federal Reserve. Now, first off, millionaires that we would call billionaires today, right? There was a big term for millionaires.
Yeah.
Millionaires don't normally give up their life in an altruistic way. I'm not saying they weren't altruistic or were altruistic in that way. I'm not even going to get into that point. But it's pretty weird that they live and they die, and then that brought in the Federal Reserve in 1913. So the Federal Reserve was set up, and what's even more interesting is 1914 we have the introduction of World War I, where 30 million people are going to die before November 11th, 1918. And you're going, wait a second, and it's one of the stupidest wars to build in. I mean, we have Prince Ferdinand and his wife that are killed in a really weird thing in Croatia time frame, and it starts spreading out. And there's crazy stuff that happens. Now, once the Federal Reserve was starting to do this, they started to devalue the money that we're going to talk a little bit more about. So I'm just going to do this basic kind of thing. But I want you to understand something even scarier. In February of 29, we wonder why the stock market in October of 29 crashes. And one of the things that was powerful, and I want you to think this way for a second. Let's say, Matt, I'm the central banker, and I'm the guy that has the money. Matt decides he wants to invest in the stock market. So he finds a stock that's worth $10, and he buys 1,000 shares, but so that would be $10,000, right? But he doesn't have $10,000 because that's a big number at the time. He only had to put 10% down on this point. So he has to put $1,000 up, a big number, but he's got something worth $10,000. By the way, you could pay off your house with $10,000. Now, what's even more interesting is that his stock moves up, and let's say it moves up to $25 a share. So there's a rocket number of shares, and he was allowed to have that kind of thing. So he moves up to $25 a share. Now he's worth $25,000 with $1,000 down. Hey man, that's a good deal. But in February of of 29, they had made the decision. This started this point of 10% down started way before that. And that's why we saw in the 20s, we saw a rocket growth in the economy because private people were doing it. So Matt's got this cash and he's thinking, oh, I'm rich, I can buy 2 houses, buy as many cars as I want to, I'm good, right? That's like having, maybe $1 million in the bank, 1.5 kind of thing. And then they said, we're going to set the margin call. There was a private meeting in February, and they said, you know what, we're going to call his margin. In October, in the stock market crash, they called the margin. So I'm the central banker dude, and I go back to Matt and say, dude, you got to come up with your original investment, which is $10,000.
Yeah. You got to pay down your debt.
You got to pay it down. And so give me $9,000. And you're like, I don't have it.
Yeah.
And you're freaking out and you don't have it. And what would happen is that you're trying to look for someone to buy it and no one wants to buy it. And I'm just standing there waiting for you. and then what would happen in essence is that I'm like, I'm going to buy it from you at $1 a share. Mm-hmm. So basically that $25 thing was devalued all the way down to $1 a share. So I give you, a minor amount of cash, and you're walking away with nothing. And he might have spent that debt in other ways.
Yeah.
He would, he's got a house, he's got, he's got this and that, and it's all based upon what was happening. Now I know I'm giving you this real big thing, but there's the stock market crash. That's why people were jumping out of windows because they had lost everything.
Yeah.
So I have a stock that really was worth. It was worth $25, but I devalued it based upon that central bank ability. So I'm taking up his asset with that too.
Yeah.
And so you sell high and buy low. Mm-hmm. And yet Matt does it the opposite way in that circumstance. Now, FDR then put a very powerful thing. Now, FDR is one of my favorite presidents. It bothered me.
Yeah.
And FDR put this thing out saying we're going to pull the gold standard. And so he said, we're going to call in gold. Now, gold in 33 was $20.60 an ounce. Then everyone had to pull in their gold. So Matt has some gold in his house. He's got some gold set up, and gold was given back and forth, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah.
So gold was given back and forth as monetary exchange, so we would have it in a paper realm. Mm-hmm. Checks and other things were actually gold-based with that. So we had a way of doing that, but the government was taking in this, and by the way, that's where we get Fort Knox. The gold we had to have a place to store this. And over the next year, gold moved up in value from 20 to $33 a share.
Yeah, they revalued it. Yep.
And they devalued you, but they revalued themselves.
Yeah.
So now I gave you, for all of your money, $20.60 an ounce, and yet then it's suddenly worth $33, and I devalued your money, and I stole from you in essence.
Yep.
And that is where we get. And then by 71, Nixon takes us fully off of that exchange, and we go into the fiat currency. The paper money, if you look on the back of your money, it is backed by what the Federal Reserve says. So I have a friend of mine who was an ex-IRS agent, and she has read the PPP loan issues. She has read the CARES Act, and I'm gonna, as both of us are writers. Okay, I've written 11 books, and this is Matt. First one. Okay, but he's gonna write plenty.
I'll probably write more. Yeah.
He's gonna write plenty more because he's got it in his heart. I know it. But do you know that the first CARES Act was 1,000 pages, backed up with a 1,200-page document, backed up with another 1,400-page document, and we're about ready to release in July of 2020 here, release maybe a fourth one. And you go, wait a second, and I ask this question of people. How can you write 1,000 pages and then 1,200 pages and 1,400 pages? And my friend had read the first two documents, and there was not one single error inside of it. That's super, super scary to me.
Yeah.
Which means that has been sitting in the background, waiting in their back pocket just to pull it out as soon as they wanted to. Yeah. So don't think that the cabal has not been bringing this on for a long time. So here's the thing, we're at this part of the fiat currency. So I was given a little bit of a background, my little thing inside of there. I think the name of the game is debt.
Yep.
So now that we have a little background and we spent a little time on that particular topic,
yeah,
let's pull forward and just pick out things that you might want to kind of identify.
I mean, don't you just find it ironic that they set up, I mean, really when they set up the Federal Reserve, I mean, one thing you should know, which was it was a collection of bankers and some people from the Treasury Department and from Congress. They went to Jekyll Island, and it was a secret meeting under the disguise of a gentleman's duck club or duck hunting meeting.
Yep.
And they manifested this idea for the Federal Reserve. And throughout America's history, there has been a constant back and forth battle between whether America should have a central bank or not, because we've actually had several central banks.
Yes.
In fact, Andrew Jackson, you know, when he went to his grave, I mean, the proudest thing that he ever did
1826
was he took out America's central bank. And even in the beginning of our country, you know, there was a great debate between Jefferson and Hamilton about, you know, whether there should be a central bank.
And Hamilton wanted it, and he won in essence, unfortunately.
Yeah. In fact, you know, Jefferson, this is my favorite quote to read from Jefferson.
Oh, yeah.
In 1798, and most people don't realize this, but he wrote to John Taylor, and he said, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that one alone for the reduction of the administration of our government to the genuine principles of its Constitution. I mean for an additional article, taking from the federal government the power of borrowing. I now deny their power of making paper money or anything else legal tender." That idea is extreme because what he's advocating for is the separation of state and money. And
better than state, church and state that he was purported to say,
yeah.
but he didn't really say that.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother story I get into.
Right.
In fact, I know where you're going with it, and I agree. But with this, it was like, you know, he saw the destructive nature if the federal government had the power to have monopoly over what could be legal tender and the power to borrow,
baby, that
the government would grow so large that we wouldn't recognize it. And that's exactly what we have today. And that's why this fight for, you know, decentralizing money and making sure that no one person has a monopoly over it was important. Because every time that we have gotten into this, our liberties have been jeopardized. In fact, even during the Revolutionary War, when we had the Continental Dollar to help pay for the war against the British, you know, they learned right before the ratification of the Constitution, like, hey, we don't need to do this paper fiat money thing because it becomes worthless. And so there was a great debate on whether they were going to put in the language of whether the federal government could emit bills of credit. And so what they did was they agreed not to put it in there, but they left the language in there for the federal government to be able to borrow. Because a lot of people ask the question, well, if they didn't put that language in there, why is the money that we use today fiat paper money? Why is it a bill of credit?
Right.
And I'm like, well, that's because the federal government is not actually issuing the money, they're borrowing it from a private central bank.
So let's do that. Let's just jump that puppy forward to what you're just saying there. So tell me how does the federal government, or specifically the Fed, and they, by the way, that was a renamed point. It was one of the most brilliant things at the Jekyll Island conversation, that they had created this whole thing. They repackaged it because it got knocked down, and Wilson was the only dude that would push that sucker forward. And he signs that December 23rd of 1913, and he signs that agreement with that. So he pushes this forward. Now, as we look at how that thing happened, how does your money go from you to the Federal Reserve and then out again? So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So essentially what happens is the United States government issues a bond, a government bond, and it's basically a glorified IOU. That bond then goes to an auction. They call it open market operations. And these 20 mega banks will actually go in and buy up these bonds, these government debts. And And what they'll do is they will then take those bonds and they will sell them to the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank, the private central bank.
Crazy.
And with a balance of zero, the Federal Reserve will issue a check, and then those banks will utilize that check, and presto, currency comes into existence. And so what happens then is
Crazy.
because the what you have is you have a buildup of Federal Reserve notes at the Treasury and a bunch of IOU government bonds at the Federal Reserve, and the big banks are basically the middlemen moving the shells around, making a profit every time they do this, because once they get that new currency, guess what they do? They go back to the open market operation and buy more government bonds, make a profit, sell it to the Federal Reserve. It's a giant Ponzi scheme that all then has to be paid back by you and I with our time, labor, and freedom.
Through our income taxes.
Through our income taxes, because coincidentally, in 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, the income tax was also put into the Constitution and made
So
for
I
the
had to
IRS.
pay my income tax. It goes directly to the IRS, and then IRS pays it to
The
who?
IRS gives it to the Treasury, and then the Treasury has to pay back the Federal Reserve.
Right. So today we have $26.5 trillion in debt.
Yeah.
Now, I remember as a business owner being, boy, Matt and I've talked about this in the past, but I was $420,000 in debt years and years ago. It was a tough time. And I remember one of my credit cards was $55,000 on the dumb credit card. It was a business, these are business situations, right? And I was paying $1,500 a month on that thing. I was barely touching the principal.
Yeah.
That's the problem we're struggling with right now. When you have 26 trillion, even at a 1.2 ratio percentage, you're maybe paying about $540 billion every year toward the debt load, and you're still not paying it down.
Yep. And the Federal Reserve has stockholders, so they have owners which receive a 6% annual dividend.
Before anything else happens, right?
Yeah.
We get to start off with this. Oh, I get the money. I get to like run into the till.
Yeah. So it's interesting because a lot of people don't realize that the Federal Reserve actually has owners, and like you were saying, a lot of these big banking families, banking institutions were a part in the creation of it, and through lots of acquisitions and mergers, they try to keep this thing under wraps. They're trying to blur the lines and keep people confused because there's so many intricacies in it that you really have to study it to because a lot of people, my head's spinning, like I can't, there's too many moving parts for me to get this. But
even the both of us have studied it for years and years, and yet we're like touching on the edge of this little thing, and we kind of pick pieces, and you're going, you don't know everything about it. No one does.
Yeah.
No one
Not even the
does.
chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and he's actually talking to the New York branch of it, who is the biggest part of it, who's over he's just the board of governors. And by the way, the president only sets up the Federal Reserve's chairman.
Yeah.
That's it. But he doesn't have to talk back to him.
Yeah.
Do you know, Bernanke actually said, I think it was in the 90s, and said, they were asking, why can't we see the balance sheet, and how come there's gold on your balance sheet, and other kinds of things. And he was like, if we opened up the books, it would hurt the whole government. So basically claim national security on the
faith and confidence.
And I'm like, wait a second, how can if I share the books with a publicly traded public company that is a problem?
Yep.
That's how we have oversight.
Yeah.
But there is no oversight with the Federal Reserve.
Yep. And I would argue too. I mean, I am highly suspicious that maybe one of the reasons why John F. Kennedy was assassinated was he had an executive order that was going to move the issuance of our money back to the Treasury.
Well, I think there's two areas that he actually we're going
NESARA.
to do a little. I love this, but because this is totally fun for you too. And you might be going, you just are conspiracy wackos. And I'm like, okay, can I just tell you? Here's the thing about a conspiracy. If Matt does something, and he will just come clean. That's my biggest thing with employees. If you do something, tell me the truth and admit your mistake on this issue, and I will actually forgive you.
Yep.
I mean, I will forgive you on that kind of thing. And don't keep making the mistake. So Matt,
Yeah.
if you're working for me, don't make the mistake over and over again, but just admit the mistake.
Yeah.
And by the way, we could actually deal with that. As a nation, we actually could deal with that, but we don't have that. We don't have that patency.
Yeah.
And you're right. JFK was going after the two groups. He was going after the CIA because he was going to break into 1,000 pieces, and he was going after the Federal Reserve because he was putting it on the gold standard.
Yep.
So as we're going to transition here in a little bit, before we fully transition into this thing, when you think about your money, you think that your money is worth more, but the reality is, what is your money worth today from when the Federal Reserve was started?
Yeah, I mean, exactly, because we've lost 98% of the purchasing power.
98%,
if not more by now. Where in 1913 when it was created, and I'm always telling people, like, listen, the Federal Reserve, a lot of this information we're talking about can be simply found on the Federal Reserve website if you actually do your homework.
Yeah.
Like, and people are just shocked to hear all this, and they go and they do their own homework. But at the end of the day, the Federal Reserve comes out and they've stated that their goal is 2% inflation. So if you don't have any way to counter that inflation, which honestly, a regular savings account at a bank account or at a bank is not going to give you 2% interest to counteract that inflation. So we are being robbed slowly and surely. It's like being a frog in a pot of boiling water until it's too late. You're just like, oh crap, because everything starts like this and this and this, and then all of a sudden at the very end it's exponential. So,
and I felt that too when I had that much debt, and when some of you've had debt issues and have debt issues, and that's another conversation. That right now on the U.S. debt clock, did you know that the credit card debt is going backward?
Yep.
Over the last about 3 weeks, we've seen in about a 2-week time frame. Did you know the debt clock has lost $25 billion? The credit card debt clock. And that's something we're going to deal with in our next video here with that too. But I want to share with you, the reality is, why are we talking about the Federal Reserve? Why do we have to have this conversation? Aren't they in it for our good?
I am always highly skeptical, and I think that's fine because it encourages one to do their homework. But if you think about it, the Bible's very clear where it talks about how the love of money is the root of all evil. Not that money's bad, but that the love of it. And it is very clear that the fallen nature of man, if not kept in check and not self-governed in a proper way, people will have massive amounts of greed. And if you give one person or group the control and issuance of our money, that's where we fall into trouble. And that's why I'm a highly proponent of decentralized systems.
I want to end this up with a couple scriptures in here, and then we will get into the NESARA in our next video with this too. James 5:3, your silver and gold are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness. That is a martyrion. That's where we get the verb, the understanding of martyr, a death issue. It will be a witness against you, not you and me. This is talking about the wicked with this. And eat your flesh up like a fire, and will be stored up as a treasure in the last days. Oh man. Verse 5 and 6 in James 5. You have lived luxuriously on the land and have indulged yourself. For the day of the slaughter you have condemned, murdered the righteous man. We just said, now, I'm not saying that JFK was righteous, but he was the beginning of something that's happening. And he does not resist you. He's really, what that is a conversation is the American people. We're going to give you one other kind of verse here. This is in Psalms 37:21. The wicked man borrows and does not repay, but the righteous one is gracious and giving. Oh my goodness. Guys, I'm going to share something with you that you might be upset about, but Donald Trump, when I first heard of him, I was like, what is he going to be doing in office?
Yeah.
And yet, I'm going to share something with you. You might look at his older history when he was not a believer, but he is a believer in Christ, and we know this very clearly. And you know what? I don't count his past sins, because if you can count his past sins, I'm going to count your past sins. I'm going to count this guy's past sins too. Okay? Because Jesus forgave our sins with that. But the wicked man borrows and does not repay, and the righteous one is gracious in giving. And so next we're going to talk a little bit about the NESARA, and we're going to show you how that NESARA part is so amazing for you. And again, there's going to be some amazing things that will come about it. So thank you so much for watching. And again, you can always go to Matt J. Moore, and you can find the Foundations of Liberty. And it is a powerful read that he's going to give you some real background in there. So subscribe to both of our channels. Thanks so much.